Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and the last time we discussed PR finales, we took a closer look at a trio of season enders that I found the most interesting based on the specific ways they don't quite work. You obviously don't need to have seen that video to understand where I'll be coming from in this one, but a lot of the cases I made against certain finales there will follow fairly similar reasoning to the cases I'll make for other finales here. And since you guys seem to be mostly content with the way I formatted that video, what with it being more conversation and less countdown, we'll stick to that here as we dive into part 1 of the best Power Rangers season finales. And worth noting is that there's no particular order here, though the second part of this discussion will naturally include the finales I'd consider in the next tier up, for what that's worth. So with all of that said, I'd like to start by discussing fan favorite RPM's finale, Danger and Destiny. There's a lot of high points and low points housed inside the Eddie Gazillion Judlin hybrid production that Disney could not have cared less about. And while we won't ever see what kind of final vision would have been enacted had Gazillion stayed aboard all throughout, what we got is still something I'd consider one of those aforementioned high points. We've discussed RPMA a fair bit in recent videos, primarily because it's now positioned to forever serve as a retroactive Beast Morphers prequel of sorts, a season unsurprisingly also helmed by Judd Lin, so we now have a chance to dig a little deeper into what made RPM's take work a bit better. One thing that really effectively carries RPM is the commitment and talent of the actors in question. More so than the 80s tribute setting or any particular plot point, the performances really do stand out, and I think that's important when the core takeaway here is how both showcasing and embracing humanity are very good things. Everything that's been built up around Dr. K and Dylan primarily is reflected in these final moments. Moments where Kay finds herself fully appreciating what a perfectly flawed human like Ziggy means to her, a far cry removed from the early days when her computer screen aesthetic was notably more closely aligned with Vengeance's chosen chic versus that of her team. Even with a heavy turnover at both the showrunner and writing level, that all too vital focus never veered off its most sensible trajectory, making it all the more rewarding that we at last see the conclusion of the coming out of her shell and facing her greatest mistake storyline. And I think that also carries a lot more weight when you have a team that starts off pretty unable to coalesce for any number of reasons, egos being among them. But just like Dr. K, most of them are driven by the missteps of their past selves and hope to find some form of redemption in the now. So not only does their coming together feel a lot more natural and lived in than something like Operation Overdrive, where I simply don't buy it, but there's a clear reason there too. But what also sells me on all of that is the part that Dylan and Tanaya play towards the resolution. Both of them were supposed to be the ace up the sleeve for Vengeance, humans that he could robotize and fully control, thus creating spot-on symbolism for his belief in the inherent superiority of machines. But Dylan and Tanaya help win the day neither by rejecting the parts of them that are Vengeance tech, nor by lacing their reformations with the idea that they are lesser than their fully human teammates. Rather, it was because Dylan has unnatural attributes that he was able to handle the RPM black powers at all. It was because Tanaya could use her inbuilt access to computer files that she ended up being an ideal ally. Regardless of how very similar all of that is on the surface to In Space, which was the other instance Lin was tasked with handling a stoic loner and an estranged but not actually evil sister, it works here. And what's more, it works in a distinct way that speaks to this particular season. That doesn't necessarily put them above what we saw from their most comparable pair years prior, at least from where I'm standing, but it's one of several really neat details in RPM that makes the story what it is. And I think that's a pretty sizable part of why it has and continues to resonate so fiercely among the fandom. So with Danger and Destiny, you have a finale that understands the narrative intent of the season and does its damnedest to finish the job in a pretty engaging way. And housed within it are small yet important details that not every PR season would quite get right, and add a lot more to what would have already been an entertaining final chapter. Or so we thought. But next up, I wanted to discuss a finale that is a lot less narratively inclined, but still knew exactly how to frame their final rescue seamlessly. The Fate of Lightspeed is an aesthetically beautiful, all-encompassing finale that tests the whole of the Aquabase squad both physically and emotionally. It's fitting that after all the rescuing they succeed in doing for others, in more ways than literal, that a rather sizable segment of their finest hour comes from the need to rescue themselves, to hold out and regain their convictions they usually have as rangers and captains and everything else to finish one more fight. It creates some standout moments of acting among the cast, in addition to smaller, more intimate moments that do really well to sell you on the atmosphere and the stakes. Kelsey is by far the most energetic and daring of the group, but when the pressure hits, we see a considerably frailer side to her. When Joel confronts this same low point, his usually unbreakable cool guy facade is firmly broken. And when Captain Mitchell has to face the destruction of the Aquabase, he simply freezes, leaving Miss Fairweather to dole out many of the orders in his stead. Every writing decision made on that end makes perfect sense given what we've seen of the characters in question, because we've seen glimpses of these characters at low points before, and this is just a further extrapolation of that. And in addition to that, it's also fitting that only through their notable connections to each other are they able to find themselves again and win the day. Because Queen Bansheera's casual sacrifice of pawns and devil-may-care attitude towards her only son work against that very notion. In a season as straightforward and to the point as Lightspeed Rescue is, all it really needed to do was present the Rangers with a challenge worthy of feeling more perilous than anything they had faced before. It's less about closing any particular character or story arc, and more about how these characters as we know them respond to all of this. But even then, there is something to be said for the interpersonal dynamics we just discussed, capped off by Carter putting the nail in the coffin of Queen Bansheera. Because while the Queen is fittingly consumed and pulled down by Diabolico and every other demon she wronged, Carter is pulled back up by teammates he never saw as below him, even while he was learning about how being a leader isn't just about being turned on at all times. Even if not everyone had a moment to truly bond with everyone else, I never thought for a second that the season lied to me when it showcases how unified they are. So even for as simple as proceedings were here, especially compared to some of the more involved PR finales, it's a pair of episodes that knows exactly what it wants to do and how to do it, and then it gets it done. Put plainly, it just works on nearly every level it aims for. When we talked about the worst finales several weeks ago, we discussed how my case against them mainly revolves around not being able to buy into the ideas they present or argue for. But with a finale like Danger and Destiny, it's considerably easier than its counterpart in Beast Morphers to buy into what it has to say on a thematic and subtextual level about its host of biologically diverse characters. And unlike with Ninja Steel's closing act, it's easier to buy into the muddled emotional states of a Lightspeed Rescue team pushed to the brink. So Dana taking on the responsibility of jarring her father loose from his feeling of failure adds up more than anything happening with the Romeros here. But I think Thunderstruck is a finale that managed to accomplish both goals concurrently, as they were able to achieve a finale that not only felt like a sensible closing point for most of their prominent ideas, but also operated with a strong level of emotional honesty about most of its proceedings, though not quite all, ergo why it's not in part 2. As we discussed in my Mesogog Focus video, the finale works so well in large part due to his relationship to Anton Mercer, both as his creator and host. Their separation created a more primal and less conniving antagonist for the Rangers to beat, one that visually embodies the rushed scientific process that mistakenly created him. And all of that comes off the back of Trent definitively proving himself to those around him. This happened notably after all the lying and deceit, some of which he was directly responsible for, that kept the Dino Thunder team from ever feeling completely at ease with him around. The action, the stakes, it all feels like a final chapter, but Trent being the one to save his dad by actually facing Mesogog is vital here, because earlier on in the story, Trent had every reason to not see his father's mindset and Mesogog's goals as different. But here, we've reached a point where not only is that separation physical, but firmly perceptible to Trent with regards to what he sees in his father now. And that to me was as good a way as any to end their character stories. Stories that carried a lot of the weight in the show once the White Ranger saga began in earnest. But this isn't to say that the finale didn't find ways to speak to the others as well, which is part of why I love that these last few episodes position the lead up to prom in the backdrop and the dance itself as the resolution. Cliche as it may be, I think it's ideally suited to highlight the ways and means this particular team came into themselves and evolved. They more than earn this formal milestone as they leave the Ranger life behind for now and continue onwards towards adulthood. It does well to capture this point in time where Connor evolved well past the selfish, arrogant, exceedingly sexist attitude he came to the show with. He was challenged to be more all throughout the season and often rose up to that challenge, despite understandable stumbles along the way. Before the season started, Ethan wouldn't have been caught dead at a prom, but we see a lot of his growth into someone of greater interpersonal skills, primarily through how he interacts with people he used to exclusively see as, frankly, not as smart as he was. And Kira goes from casual lawn performer to playing for the whole school. Doesn't get much clearer than that. Hell, even the criminally underrated Cassidy Cornell is a much more mature, wise, and well-rounded character than where she started. Same for Devin to a lesser but still identifiable extent. So this prom is a lot more than just a formal dance to me. As the resolution to one of the more genuine coming-of-age narratives PR has ever given us, it really does its job of informing us how far this team has come, which also makes the photo montage, cheesy as it almost always is, the good kind of cheesy. To close things out, I'd be remiss to not quickly go over finales I find really good or interesting, but not quite to the same conversational extent as my three primary examples. So you can consider this something of a makeshift honorable mention section, though that isn't to say that these selections are necessarily of lesser quality. I want to first bring up Storm Before the Calm, because it's one of those cases where Ninja Storm, as it every now and then does, finds this really neat balance between its hilariously entertaining aspects and its more story-driven aspects. Since Doug Sloan and Ann Austin ran this show too, it should come as no surprise that it shares some of the qualities that made Dino Thunder's finale special, sans the more narratively charged elements. But it does fall short in terms of really bringing some of the story elements full circle, especially since the idea of the original trio having always been destined for these powers takes a lot away from how they stumbled onto them through selflessness. And since ancient scrolls never told of the samurai journey, among many other things, it would have made for stronger writing to stick to the accidental nature of their promotion to go alongside Cam's insistence to also go against the grain. But still, overall a really good time and a really good pair of episodes. Power Rangers Samurai is a great many things, and most of that many isn't what I'd call spectacular. But perhaps its single greatest aspect is how the first finale came together. Worth noting is that once the Nick agreement happened, PR had to jerry-rig a reason to arbitrarily separate the story of Samurai into two distinct parts. In turn, the writing team created one of the few major changes they were allowed to make to what was ostensibly a Sentai dub. By reworking Decker and Dayu's backstories in what I'd consider a two-part Season 1 finale, I think they became vastly better characters than they're often given credit for. Because now, instead of being a copy and paste of two villains who felt largely like disconnected elements in the Shinkenger story, the pair here have a past that comes off a lot more connected to the people Jaden and Mia could reasonably become someday. And Dayu being the one responsible for attempting to save Decker and having that backfire so very hard adds much greater weight to her own plight. Granted, Mia's part to play in this revelation does next to nothing for her after the fact, mainly because Super Samurai isn't very good in most respects. But I do think the inevitable duel between Decker and Jaden, and how that stems from both having a sword-wielding destiny forced upon them, that actually works really well, and mostly continues to. Their unwillingness to allow Alex Hartman to really express himself more earnestly in these moments does not help at all, and his stoicism has been discussed to death. But as an idea, as a piece of writing, it made for a genuinely good pair of episodes, especially coming out of the confines of a writer's room where not a ton of good was permitted. And speaking of needing arbitrary breakpoints during the Nick era, I really love the Dino Charge Season 1 finale, One More Energem. It's a really fun way to cap off what was a really fun ride. Similar to my thoughts on Ninja Storm's finale, but without some of my issues there. And let's be real here, guys, there was absolutely no chance I'd avoid talking about a finale that heavily focuses on one of my favorite PR characters ever getting to be an even bigger badass than usual, and in doing so, earning her powers in a way that aligns perfectly with how the Energems tend to work as plot devices. It's neither as intriguing as Samurai's first finale, nor is it as resonating as a lot of the other finales we talked about in greater length. But it's one of those episodes that just has everything I love about the season happening all at once, and any episode that can do that is worth praising. When part 2 drops, we'll continue discussing PR finales and which ones I think are of the highest overall quality. And while I severely doubt most of the entries will be surprising to any of you, I hope that talking about what they do right will be entertaining at worst and thought-provoking at best. But until then, thanks for watching.